In the autumn of 1887, in the high country east of Leadville, Colorado, there was a mine that no one wanted. It had a name once, the Callaway Lode. It had a number on a territorial survey map, a claim stake driven into frost-hardened ground by a man who had believed, the way desperate men believe, that the mountain held something worth the cost of believing. That man was dead. The claim had reverted to the county for back taxes. The main shaft had caved in April, after the snowmelt swelled the ground and the rotted timber cribbing gave way all at once, and the whole upper collar of the mine had folded like a letter being pushed into an envelope. It sat on 12 acres of spruce-choked hillside at 8,000 feet, above a creek that went dry in July and ran black with snowmelt in March, and the land office in Leadville had listed it as a non-performing extraction claim, $1 minimum, no takers at the August auction. Nora Strand paid the dollar. Say, she was 27 years old that October, and she had come to Leadville the previous spring with $38 sewn into the lining of her coat, a leather roll of timber framing tools her father had carried for 20 years in the coal country of western Pennsylvania, and a certification from the Fayette County Bureau of Mine Safety that she had passed the practical examination in timbering assessment at the rank of inspector's assistant. Her father, Reuben Strand, had taught her the work the way a good craftsman teaches, not by telling her what the rules said, but by showing her what the wood did under load, what the grain of a compromised beam looked like before it failed, what sounds a properly set cap piece made when the mountain shifted against it in the middle of a night repair. He had died of a lung infection in February, 2 weeks before the certification arrived, and she had carried the paper west because there was nothing left to stay for. And because she understood, in the direct and practical way her father had trained her to understand things, that the knowledge was worth something somewhere, even if Pennsylvania no longer was. She had spent the spring and summer of 1887 working for 2 different mine operators in the Leadville district, both of whom had hired her for timbering assessment, and both of whom had paid her at roughly 2/3 the rate they paid the men who did the same work, which she noted and accepted without comment, because the work itself was what she had come for. The first operator, a man named Hartley who ran the Empress shaft on the south side of Carbonate Hill, had been initially skeptical and then privately satisfied, because the capset failure she had identified in his 4th level had been repaired before it could compromise the workings above it, and because he had seen, in the summer of 1886, what happened to the man in the neighboring claim who had employed no one capable of reading the same warning. The second operator, who ran a smaller surface lease operation near Malta, had let her go at the end of the season when the works went to caretaker status for winter. She had taken the severance without resentment and gone to the land office to look at what was available. The land office clerks in Leadville had developed, over the 10 years of the district's major activity, a system of quiet taxonomy for the people who came through their door. The large-scale operators went in one category, the small speculators in another. The destitute went in a third, because they were the ones who bought the non-performing claims, the played-out shafts and the flood-prone slopes and the $1 auctions that the serious men had long since stopped attending. Nora had been placed in the third category by a clerk named Dobbins, who had noted her age, her sex, and the absence of a male companion, and had drawn his conclusions accordingly. She had filled out the claim transfer form in the careful hand she used for official documents, paid the dollar coin across the counter, and taken the deed without comment. The way Dobbins folded the deed before handing it across told her something about what he thought of the transaction, which was what small official ceremonies often told her about the men performing them. He thought she had wasted her dollar. She put the deed in her coat pocket alongside the survey notebook and walked out into the October cold. There are choices that look like mistakes from the outside and are not mistakes at all, because the person making them can see something the watchers cannot. Nora had looked at the Callaway Lode survey description for 30 minutes before she spent her dollar, and what she had seen in the survey was not the caved portal or the 12 acres of scrub ground. She had seen the portal dimensions listed in the 1882 inspection record, which showed original timbering at the collar dated to the construction of the mine, and then she had seen that the inspection record prior to that one, from 1878, had described the portal timbering as already showing age in checking, which meant the timbering at the collar had been in place since at least the mid-1870s, which was earlier than Callaway's 1879 claim date would suggest. Someone had been working this ground before Callaway. She had not said this to the clerk. She had put it in the survey notebook in her own abbreviated notation and taken the deed. The road to the Callaway claim was a track, not a road. 2 miles of switchback through lodgepole pine and over a creek crossing, where the plank bridge had shed 2 of its 3 cross members, leaving a single beam over cold water, and then a last steep quarter-mile up bare granite rubble to the mine portal. She had rented a mule from a livery on Harrison Avenue, loaded it with a lantern, her tool roll, 3 days of provisions, and a 50-foot coil of hemp rope. She made the portal by late afternoon. The collapse was worse than the land office survey had indicated, which she had expected, because land office surveys of non-performing claims were written by men who went out once and did not go back. The main portal, a timber-framed opening that would have been roughly 6 feet high and 4 feet wide in its working days, had compressed to a ragged gap perhaps 18 inches tall along the left side, where one corner post had held while the rest buckled. The portal timber was old-growth spruce, hand-hewn in the early manner of the 1870s, and the collapse had split the crown piece along a sheer-grain flaw that a competent inspector would have flagged years earlier. The rubble was dry sandstone and decomposed granite, the loose material already compacted by months of weathering, and a line of spruce saplings had begun to colonize the debris cone, with the patient determination of young trees that have found disturbed ground. She did not try to enter that afternoon. She set her camp 30 feet back from the collapse, staked the mule where it could graze the last of the frost-yellowed grass, and worked until dark, taking measurements and recording them in her survey notebook. The notebook was her father's. The first half filled with his notations from the Pennsylvania work, figures and sketches in his precise small hand, the names of mines and their particular failure modes, the dates of repairs and what each repair had required. The second half had been left blank, and she had been using it since February. The open pages had bothered her at first, the way an empty half of anything left behind by a person who is gone can bother. She had filled 6 pages already since Leadville and the work had helped. That was the habit her father had drilled into her before any other. Measure before you move. Understand the load path before you touch the structure. He had said it the first time when she was 11 years old, and she had reached for a prop timber in a culvert repair near their house outside Uniontown, and he had caught her wrist gently and said, "The load finds the weak point. Never become the weak point's neighbor until you know where it is." She had thought about that particular sentence many times since February. It seemed to her to apply to more than mine work, and she thought her father had probably known it did. The next morning, before the sun cleared the ridge to the east, she began. The standard approach to a collapsed mine portal, as the Fayette County Training Manual described it, was to clear debris from the top of the collapse first, relieving the weight bearing on whatever remained of the original timbering below. She worked differently, because her father had taught her to work from the failure backward. The collapse had an originating point, a place where the first failure had propagated outward. Find the origin and you understood the geometry of everything that had followed, which meant you did not move anything you would need later. She spent the first 2 hours at the base of the debris cone, not moving rock but reading it, tracing the fracture patterns in the sandstone slabs, and matching them to the residual bow in the surviving crown piece. The failure had begun in the right side post, not the left. The right side post had a hidden check crack in the heartwood, invisible from the face of the timber, the kind that only showed itself when the wood had been in service long enough for the internal stress to work outward from the pith. It had given way first under the mountain's weight, loaded the crown piece asymmetrically, and that asymmetric load had split the crown along the grain. The left post had held because it was the lesser loaded member, and because whoever had set it had chosen a cleaner piece of timber, a piece without the hidden check. This was important. It meant the left post, though tilted inward at roughly 7 degrees, was still capable of bearing load if properly braced. She would not need to clear the whole collapse from above, which would have taken 4 or 5 days with a proper crew and equipment she did not have. She could build a new support around the surviving left post, relieve the settled debris of its bearing load one section at a time, and open a passage through the left side of the collapse in perhaps 2 days of careful work. She had brought the right materials, which was not an accident. Her father's tool roll contained a froe, 2 hardwood wedges, a timber scriber, a mallet, and a folding brace with a set of shell bits. From the saddlebags, she unpacked a set of dry pine planks she had cut herself at a mill yard 2 miles south of town the previous afternoon, paying $2.20 for the lumber and hauling it lashed across the mule's back through the October cold. The planks were not finished lumber. They were rough-cut 1-inch stock, and she had selected each piece by feel and eye for straight grain and freedom from knot clusters, the way her father had selected framing stock for repair work. He had told her that a rushed carpenter bought what the yard offered. A careful one told the yard what to pull. She set her first temporary brace at 11 in the morning, driving the bearing foot into the compacted debris floor until it found solid resistance, then wedging the headplate tight against the settling crown piece with 2 opposing hardwood wedges that locked under load rather than slipping free. She placed her palm against the face of the brace after seating it and held it there, feeling for the live vibration that an improperly seated member carried when the load shifted, the faint buzzing in the wood that her father had taught her to read as a structure's way of reporting its own distress. There was none. By mid-afternoon, she had 3 braces in place, each driven into bearing, each checked, each silent under her hand. The passage she opened by evening was 22 inches wide and 4 feet clear in height, running along the left side of the original portal where the surviving post stood. It was not a comfortable entry. She was slender enough to manage it, and she had worked in tighter places with her father in the repair work at the Uniontown Colliery, where the old works had subsided over decades into configurations no regulation would have permitted, and where the only way to reach a failing section was often through a route that made her wish she had not been paying attention to her own breathing. She pulled the lantern through on a length of cord, followed it on her hands and knees, and straightened up inside. The smell reached her before anything else. Dry, cold, mineral. The particular mineral cold of a mine that has been sealed long enough to lose any trace of the men who worked it. The residue of bodies and breath and lantern smoke, and the particular animal smell of horse sweat and manure from ore haul animals that gives a working mine its lived-in character. This mine had none of that. It smelled like stone and time, like a thing that had been waiting. She held the lantern up and turned slowly. The main drift ran roughly north, following the ore vein at a slight downward grade of about 3 degrees, typical of the Leadville district's carbonate ore formation. The timbering inside was in substantially better condition than the portal, protected from the weathering that had destroyed the collar. The cap sets were still in place along the first 40 feet, heavy spruce caps on spruce posts, blackened with age and the lamp black that Years of miners' candles deposit on every surface within a working mine, but not structurally failed, not even close to failing. She checked 4 of them by pressing at the joint intersections and found the bearing surfaces still tight. Whoever had set these timbers had known their work. The cap pieces were seated in proper notched housings on the post tops, not simply rested against the face, and the wedges between the cap and the post were still in bearing after a decade of neglect. These were not the timbers of a man who had thrown up a mine and hoped. The floor of the drift was packed fine material, the tailings of the original drilling work mixed with decades of mineral drip and settle. In the lantern light, the walls were a pale gray limestone with threads of iron-stained quartz running through it at a shallow angle, and here and there a fissure vein of galena, the lead sulfide mineral that ran with the silver ore in this part of the range, its surface dull and blue-gray and unmistakable. At 60 feet, the drift widened into a small working chamber, perhaps 12 feet by 8, where the original miners had followed a richer vein pocket before it pinched out to the north. The chamber held what she had expected to find in an abandoned mine, a broken hand drill, its steel head rusted to the wooden haft in a single mass of oxidized iron, a pile of collapsed leather harness from a single jack horse that had hauled the ore cars. 2 wooden ore cars, their iron wheel flanges orange with surface rust, but the wood bodies still sound, sitting on a section of the narrow gauge track that ran back toward the portal. The track was wooden railed with iron cap, common for smaller mines of the 1870s that could not afford full iron rail, and the wood rail had checked and split with age, but the iron caps were still sound and still spiked. There was a mining log on a wooden shelf nailed to the left wall of the chamber, a small journal, its cover water-stained around the edges where moisture had worked along the shelf's surface over the years, but the pages inside dry and intact. She did not open it yet. She noted it in her survey notebook with a location sketch and continued her examination of the chamber. And on the far wall of the chamber, where the vein pocket had been followed deepest into the mountain, there was a timber. It was a single square post timber, roughly 6 inches by 6 inches, set apart from the mine's structural timbering and not original to it. It had been wedged into a natural crack in the limestone wall and held there by the weight of a flat slab laid across its top. It was not structural. It held no load. It had been placed deliberately, the way a person places a thing that is meant to remain standing until someone comes for it, as a marker or a testament or a warning, in the patient manner of a man who understood that the mountain could keep a thing intact long after he could not. Nailed to the face of the post, at eye height, was a piece of sheet tin. The tin was roughly cut, edges ragged, the kind salvaged from a lard can or a lantern housing. On its face, incised with a nail point in the laborious block letters of a man who had not done much writing, but who had done this writing with great care, were 2 words and a number. Voss Claim, 1874. She stood in front of it for a long time. The name Voss was not on the deed she carried in her coat pocket. The deed named the claim as the Callaway Lode, filed in 1879 by one Elias Callaway of Lake County, Colorado Territory. The land office had no record of any prior claim on this ground. The survey map had said so, the clerk had said so, and the record book had confirmed it when she read it herself, twice, with the careful attention she applied to documents that she expected to argue from later. But prior claims did not expire by failing to appear in the current record. A prior claim that had been actively worked and then improperly voided remained a legal instrument under territorial mining law if the original locator or his heirs could demonstrate the prior location date and the fact of work performed. She was standing in a chamber full of work performed, and 1874 predated Callaway's 1879 filing by 5 years. She took the tin plate from the post carefully, wrapping it in her neckerchief so the edges would not scratch against anything else in her pocket. She put it in the front pocket of her coat. Then she opened the mining log. The entries began in the summer of 1874 in a clear, methodical hand, the handwriting of a man accustomed to keeping records, and they continued through the winter of 1876 in two hands, one the original and one a rougher version of it, suggesting two men taking turns. The entries recorded footage advanced, drill steel used, ore car loads hauled, timber ordered and set, the names of the hired day laborers who worked the occasional shift, and how much they had been paid. The last entry in the rougher hand was dated March the 14th, 1877. It recorded 3 feet of advance to the north face. It noted that the eastern branch of the vein had been discussed, and a decision would be made after the thaw. It was the last entry by that hand. The first hand continued alone through the autumn of 1878, the entries growing shorter as the months passed, recording smaller amounts of work, noting days when no advance had been made. The final entry was October 3rd, 1878. It said, 17 inches to the north face, timbering at the new cap set complete. The ore vein pinches here, but the eastern branch remains. I cannot continue the east work alone. She wrote the dates and the salient details in her survey notebook and replaced the mining log on the shelf. She worked for the next hour, mapping the chamber by lamplight, measuring and recording. The set of the vein, the depth of the working face, the spacing of the hand drill marks in the limestone, which told her something about how many men had worked and for how long. 2 men, working the drift for at minimum 2 years, possibly 3, to have advanced this far into the mountain at the depth and consistency she was measuring. 2 men who had done the work correctly, from the timbering to the drainage slope to the record keeping, and whose entire claim to the mountain had been made to vanish. It was near midnight when she came back through the braced passage into the cold air. The mule stood with its head down and its eyes half closed, indifferent to the hour. She built a small fire from the deadfall around her camp, warmed a tin of beans, and sat looking at the tin plate in the firelight. The letters were shallow but deliberate, not a careless scratch. A man writing his name into a wall because he needed it to stay there longer than he could. She slept 4 hours and was on the road to Leadville before first light. The land office opened at 8. She was there at 10 past, when the clerk arrived and unlocked the door and hung his coat on the peg behind the counter. She asked to see the filing register for Lake County mining claims from 1872 through 1876. The clerk, Dobbins again, said the earlier registers were kept in the basement storage and might take some time to retrieve. She said she would wait and sat down on the bench along the wall and took out her survey notebook and read back through her notes from the previous 2 days while he was gone. The earlier register was a leather-bound ledger, water-stained along the spine from a basement flood at some previous date but intact, its pages written in the careful copperplate of a territorial clerk who had understood that the record he was creating would matter. She found what she was looking for on page 47 of the 1874 entries, the Voss location notice. Filed October the 9th, 1874, by Gunnar Voss and his brother Carl Voss, both of Lake County, Colorado Territory, 12 acres. The description of the boundaries matched the Callaway deed with sufficient specificity that a court would have no difficulty establishing they described the same ground. The location notice had been signed by both men, witnessed by a third party named Arnie Dahl, and stamped with the Lake County Recorder's seal. Immediately below the notice, in the same hand but written with a different pen and in darker ink, was a notation added at a later date, October the 3rd, 1879. It read, Location claim surrendered and stricken per affidavit of abandonment filed by Elias Callaway, claimant of record, Lake County District Court, Case 1879-144. She wrote down the case number and asked for the district court register. The case file was thin. A 2-page affidavit signed by Elias Callaway, attesting that the Voss location had been abandoned for a period of not less than 3 years, that no work had been performed upon the claim during that period, and that no owners or heirs of the locators could be located in the territory. On the basis of this affidavit, the district court had ordered the location notice voided and the claim opened for relocation, which Callaway had filed under his own name as the Callaway Lode on the same day the voiding order was entered. Callaway's affidavit was dated August the 15th, 1879. The mining log she had left on the shelf in the working chamber recorded active work on the claim through October of 1878. That was 10 months, not 3 years. And the claim had not been abandoned in any meaningful sense of the word. One of the locators had continued working it alone until his health failed. She spent the next 2 days in the county records. The burial register at the Catholic Church on West 7th Street showed Gunnar Voss died June 14, 1879. Cause listed as consumption. The assessor's property roll for 1877 showed Gunnar Voss as the sole taxpayer on the claim, Carl Voss having been removed from the co-owner notation, suggesting a partition or buyout of Carl's interest around that time. A note in the tax records for 1878 indicated that Gunnar Voss had applied for a hardship deferral of his property taxes, citing illness. Callaway had filed his abandonment affidavit 8 weeks after Gunnar Voss died. He had sworn that no work had been performed when the mining log recorded work through the previous autumn. He had sworn that no owners or heirs could be located when Gunnar Voss had died in Leadville with a known address, a church burial, and whatever family he had left. He had moved precisely and quickly through the legal machinery available to him, and the machinery had moved as designed because no one with standing had appeared to contest it. There was a third name on the original location notice, Arne Dahl, witness. She found Dahl through the town directory, the assessor's rolls, and a 15-minute conversation with an elderly Norwegian-born blacksmith on Poplar Street named Halverson, who knew Dahl from the old country and said he had worked the stamp mills west of town for years, and now kept a small cabin near the Malta Road, 3 miles out. He was 71 and not easy to approach, Halverson said. She asked what that meant, and Halverson said Dahl had watched the district chew through men for 20 years and had learned to be careful about what he involved himself in. She thanked Halverson for the tea, which she had not asked for but which he had set in front of her anyway, and went out the following morning. The cabin sat in a clearing of second-growth aspen and lodgepole, its walls chinked tightly against the altitude winters, its roof recently patched with new shake shingles over the old, where the original had begun to lift. She noted the woodpile stacked 8 feet high against the north wall, the root vegetable garden put to bed under straw mulch, the cast-iron stovepipe drawing cleanly. These were the choices of a man who had not made his peace with the idea of letting things deteriorate. Dahl came to the door with the wariness of a man who had learned to answer knocking slowly. He was white-haired and broad-shouldered, the musculature of 30 years of hard labor still legible in his frame, even at 71, and he looked at Nora the way he would have looked at any unexpected arrival, with the assessing patience of someone who would make no move until he understood the situation. She introduced herself. She said she had purchased the Callaway claim and had found evidence inside the mine that suggested the claim had been improperly voided in 1879. She said she needed to speak with someone who had known the Voss brothers. He did not invite her in immediately. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking past her at the road, and she waited without pressing, because she had dealt with enough cautious men to know that pressing was the surest way to close a door that would otherwise open on its own. "Come in," he said. What Dahl told her over the next 2 hours, sitting at a pine table in the clean and orderly interior of the cabin, in the deliberate and precise sentences of a man who weighed his words because he had learned what careless words cost, was this. Gunnar and Carl Voss had worked the claim from the summer of 1874 through the spring of 1877, when Carl had left after a dispute. Carl had believed the ore vein ran deeper to the east and wanted to follow it with a new drift. Gunnar had believed it ran north and wanted to stay the course and complete the current workings before committing to a new direction. The dispute had been serious, as disputes between brothers over the direction of shared work often are, and Carl had gone and not come back. Gunnar had continued alone, working with hired day labor on the larger tasks and doing much of the smaller work himself. He had continued through 1877 and 1878, keeping his records and maintaining his timbering until the spring of 1879, when his lungs had finally failed him under the altitude and the mine dust, the same combination that killed a great many men in the Leadville district and was accepted as an ordinary feature of the work. In the months before his death, Gunnar had asked Dahl to register the claim status with the county recorder, to keep the record current and to prevent exactly the kind of voiding by inactivity that the territorial law permitted. Dahl had gone to the recorder's office in May of 1879 and had been told by a clerk he had not spoken with before that the claim had already been voided and refiled under Callaway's name. That had been false. The voiding order was dated October the 3rd, 5 months after Dahl's attempt. But the clerk had told him the claim was already gone, and Dahl, who wasn't a lawyer and did not know to ask for the documentation, had accepted it. Gunnar was dying by then, and the news had been kept from him. There had seemed, at the time, to be no remedy. Callaway, Dahl said, had been a figure in the district for several years before 1879. He operated at the edges of legitimate claim activity, in the space between what the law permitted and what it could prove. And he was not the only man doing so. The Leadville district in its peak years was a place where paper moved fast and questions moved slow, and a man who understood the legal machinery and could act quickly when a claim appeared vulnerable could accumulate property that he had not earned through labor. Callaway had the paperwork ready. He had known the moment to file. He had known, Dahl believed, that Gunnar was ill and Carl was gone, and that no one with standing would contest. He was not a man who made mistakes, Dahl said. His voice was flat and even, which was somehow harder to hear than grief would have been. Gunnar Voss had a daughter, Dahl said. She had been 12 years old when he died. Her name was Marta. She was living in Denver, working as a seamstress. Dahl had her address because he had written to her once, years ago, to tell her what he believed had happened to her father's claim, and she had written back to say she had no way to contest it, and he should not trouble himself further on her account. He had kept her letter because he did not know what else to do with it. He went to the box on the shelf above his workbench and came back with a small envelope, a daguerreotype wrapped in brown paper, and a folded letter. He set the daguerreotype in front of her first. Gunnar Voss stood at the mouth of the mine portal in the photograph, taken by an itinerant photographer in the summer of 1876, judging by the condition of the timbering visible behind him. He had a hand drill balanced on his right shoulder, and he was squinting into the sunlight with the expression of a man who was exactly where he intended to be. He was not a large man. He was slight and fair-haired, and he stood with the easy uprightness of someone who had spent enough time underground to find the open air a privilege rather than a given. She looked at the photograph for a moment and then handed it back. Dahl put it away. The legal proceeding took 4 months. She could not have managed it alone. The territorial mining law was specific, but its machinery was not built for claimants who had no money and no political standing in the district, and she needed a recorder's clerk who understood the reinstatement procedure and a territorial court willing to hear a challenge to a title transfer. 9 years old. What she brought to both was the tin plate, the 1874 location notice in the county ledger, the mining log with its final entries in October of 1878, the gap between the date of Gunnar Voss's illness and the date Calloway had filed his affidavit, and Arne Dahl, who was willing to sign a written account of what he had attempted in May of 1879 and what he had been told. She presented the case herself, with the assistance of a young territorial attorney named Birch, who charged her $3 for 2 hours of his time, and told her the case was straightforward if the court was willing to look at it. The court was willing because the recorder's clerk who had told Dahl the claim was already gone in May of 1879 had since died and could not be questioned, which removed the only person who might have been embarrassed by the proceeding. And because the judge who heard the case was a man who had a particular dislike of affidavit fraud and was not reluctant to say so from the bench, Calloway was not present in the territory to contest the finding. He had sold the claim to the county tax lien 3 years earlier and moved to Nevada, where he had continued to operate in the same manner until a similar proceeding in that district had gone less smoothly for him. The county, which had sold the claim to Nora for $1 and had no interest in defending a fraudulent title, did not contest. The affidavit of abandonment was found to have materially misrepresented the state of the claim at the time of filing, because the mining log established active work through October of 1878, which was 15 months before the claimed abandonment period of 3 years would have begun. The voiding order was reversed. The original Voss location notice was reinstated. The claim passed to the Voss estate in February of 1888. Marta Voss was 21 years old, a seamstress in Denver, and she came to Leadville in March on the train from the south. Nora met her at the depot, which was a thing she had decided to do because Leadville was not an easy city for a young woman arriving alone, with no knowledge of its geography, and because she thought that receiving news of this kind in a railway depot, surrounded by strangers, was a poor way to receive it. Marta was small and dark-haired, with her father's slight build and her father's quality of looking at things directly, rather than obliquely, which Nora noted from the first moment. She stood on the platform in a coat that was too light for the altitude and the early spring cold, looking around the town with an expression Nora recognized, the expression of someone trying to match a place against a memory they had only inherited, not lived in. They went to Dahl's cabin first, because it seemed right that the three of them should be in the same room before any document was discussed. He had a pot of tea ready, which he had not done the first day Nora came, and he stood up when they came in, which he had not done that day either. And these small adjustments told her something about what this occasion meant to him. He gave Marta the photograph. He set it on the table in front of her and did not explain it, because it did not require explanation. She picked it up and looked at it for a long time, and the expression on her face was the kind that has no name, because it contains too many things at once. She had been 12 years old when her father died. She had grown up with a story that had no ending, except a debt and an absence, and the knowledge that something had been taken that she could not get back. He built that himself, Dahl said, meaning the timbering visible in the photograph behind her father's shoulder. Every cap set in there. He cut and seated by hand. Marta set the photograph down on the table and didn't pick it up again immediately, but she kept her hand beside it. The Calloway claim was worth something in the practical sense, though not in the way the large operators measured worth. A proper assay of the chamber walls conducted by a Leadville mining engineer in April showed sufficient galena and silver carbonate in the eastern face of the working chamber to warrant a new drift following the branch Carl Voss had argued for in 1877. The vein Gunnar had worked north had indeed pinched out as the mining log recorded, but the East Branch remained untested ground. Marta sold the development rights to a small operating company for $420, retaining ownership of the surface acres, and used the money to retire a debt her mother had been carrying since 1880. She asked Nora what she wanted for her work. Nora had thought about this before Marta arrived, because she did not like to be asked questions she had not already answered to herself. She said she wanted the mining log recovered from the working chamber returned to Marta's keeping, because it was the piece of evidence that had made the case, and because it had been written in her father's hand and belonged with his family. She wanted the $1 she had paid for the claim refunded because that was tidy, and she would take $15 for the timbering work because that was what the lumber and the labor had cost her. Marta paid all of it without comment and added $2 more without explanation. Nora did not return them. She went back to the mine alone a week later before the operating company sent its crew up to begin the eastern drift. She wanted to examine the timbering in the main drift one more time, partly because she had recommended the condition of the existing capsets in her written report and wanted to confirm her assessment before other men's lives depended on it, and partly for a reason she did not articulate to anyone. The temporary bracing at the portal was still in place, and she checked each member before she went through. Inside, the smell was the same: dry, cold, mineral. The lantern light fell on the same pale walls. In the working chamber, the post was still standing in its crack in the limestone wall, with the flat slab balanced across its top. The tin plate was in the courthouse in Leadville now, 2 words and a number in a court record that would remain as long as the building stood. But the post remained, which was as it should be. It had done its work. It had kept its message for 9 years in the cold and the dark and the silence, and the right hand had come along to read it. She put her palm flat against the face of the post. The wood was cold and dry and utterly still under her hand, the way properly set timber feels when the load above it is well distributed and nothing is asking more of it than it can give. She thought about her father for a moment, not with the sharp grief of the winter, but with the steadier feeling that had taken its place over the months. The feeling of carrying something forward that was worth carrying. He had shown her how to read what wood held. He had not told her she would use it in a mine in the Colorado mountains to read the record of a dead man's claim. But the knowledge had gone where it was needed, which was the way his knowledge tended to go. She picked up her lantern and walked back out through the drift, through the braced passage, into the April light. Below her, the creek had started running again with the snowmelt, clear and cold over the granite, catching the afternoon light in the broken and shifting way that moving water in the high country does, throwing brief, bright pieces of light that did not hold their shape but kept moving. The mule stood at the edge of the camp with its head turned toward her, patient in the way mules are patient, which is not like any other kind of patience. She coiled the rope. She rolled her tools into the leather case and buckled it, feeling the familiar weight of each implement settle into its place. She took a last look at the portal, at the braced passage she had opened through the debris, at the surviving post still holding its lean inside the frame. Then she started down the mountain. If you have ever found something a person buried because they needed it to outlast them, you know what it costs to carry it back into the light where it belongs. If a name matters to you the way a name once mattered to someone who had no other way to preserve it, leave a word in the comments below. And if you want another story about the things this country hid in places it thought no one would look, there is one waiting just ahead. The tin plate is in the courthouse in Leadville to this day, as far as the record shows. 2 words and a number, scratched into a salvaged piece of sheet metal by a dying man who understood that the mountain would keep his record longer than he could, and who trusted that the right hand would eventually come along to read it. He did not trust wrong.